They thought it would be a quiet takedown, a casual ambush, masked as tough journalism. The plan was simple: invite Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to The View, lure her into a false sense of safety, then hit her with a question sharp enough to draw blood. Live on national television. What they didn't expect was a microphone that kept recording after the cameras stopped. What they didn't count on was a paper trail, a passive donation, and a silence that said more than any headline. And what they never imagined was that the woman they tried to humiliate would calmly walk off that stage, gather every receipt, and return with something more powerful than applause: truth. This is a dramatized account based on real dynamics between media, politics, and power. While the characters and events in this story are fictionalized, the emotional core, the manipulation, the dignity, the public awakening is deeply real. If you've ever watched a screen and wondered who's pulling the strings behind the questions, stay with us, because this time, the mic was still on. And the script, she rewrote it herself. They don't invite you to destroy you. Not at first. It started with a beige envelope, not an email, not a DM. A real envelope, stamped, embossed, hand-delivered to her Capitol Hill office like it came from another century. The gold foil seal read simply, "The View, ABC Studios." No handwritten note, no smiley faces. Just a typed message. "We are honored to invite Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as a featured guest on an upcoming episode of The View, part of our Women in Power special series airing this fall." Her staff stared at the letter in silence, like it was a trap disguised as a trophy. "They want her charm, not her challenge," her comms director muttered, thumbing through the attached logistics. The offer came with velvet gloves, pre-approved topics, structured timing, balanced tone. They assured her there'd be no political ambushes, no surprise questions. Everything above board. Too above board, almost. "They usually don't try this hard to be polite," AOC said, half smiling. She flipped the letter over, checking the back like it might reveal a second meaning. Her phone buzzed. A reminder: debrief with immigration advocates. 2:30 p.m. She silenced it. For the first time in months, she hesitated to move on. That night back in her apartment, her mother was chopping cilantro in the kitchen. The air smelled of lime and slow-braised beans, the kind of scent that never made it onto campaign trails. "They want me on The View," AOC said casually, knowing full well it wasn't casual. Her mother paused, knife midair. "Again? No, not like last time. This one's glossy, celebratory. They're doing a series on women in leadership. Condoleezza Rice was last week. They say I'd close the season." Her mother laughed softly. "And I suppose they'll let you speak without interruptions and tell the truth uncut?" She returned to chopping. AOC shrugged. "They gave us the topics: immigration, youth voting, women's economic independence, nothing hostile." Her mother set the knife down, dried her hands, looked at her daughter with the kind of gaze that wasn't maternal so much as ancestral, weighty with everything unsaid. "They don't have to raise their voice to try and shrink you, mija. But if you go, make sure they see your eyes, not just your soundbite." A pause, then softly. "They need to see someone like you speak plainly, for girls who'll never be invited into that room." Back at the office, the team dissected every detail of the production rundown, like it was a contract with hidden clauses. The seating chart showed her flanked by two neutral co-hosts. The segment title, "Hope and Heat, Young Leaders Reshaping the Future." Harmless, almost syrupy. But it was the email from the producer that caught her speechwriter's attention. "We're thrilled to welcome the Congresswoman. Let her know we want this to feel comfortable, even cozy. We're hoping she lets her guard down." That sentence stuck. Cozy, for a politician whose every word gets clipped and spun? "Cozy isn't comfort," AOC murmured. "It's camouflage." She said yes, but she added a new section to her prep binder, one labeled contingency, and in her notebook, on the last page, she scribbled 5 words. "Don't confuse smiles with safety." The invitation was accepted. The flights were booked. What no one knew, not her staff, not even her mother, was that in the weeks leading up to the show, AOC had been receiving anonymous envelopes. No return address, no letter inside, just screenshots. Screenshots of internal show emails, and one with no context that read, "Let's give her the kind of moment she can't edit later." There was a time she couldn't sleep before interviews, not because of the cameras, but because of what they might reduce her to. AOC sat at her kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a chipped mug of coffee gone cold. The binder lay open in front of her, tabs labeled Women's Labor Equity, Latina Voter Turnout, Federal Child Care Subsidies. All facts, no fluff. But her eyes weren't on the stats. They were watching something else entirely, playing again in her mind like an old clip you don't choose to remember, but can't forget. Her first national TV appearance, the morning after she won the primary. They'd told her it would be a short, congratulatory segment. 5 minutes, light questions, focus on the historic nature of the win. But as soon as the red light blinked on, the anchor's voice shifted, tone sharper, smile thinner. "You say you're for working people, but how do you explain funding from fringe activists?" There was no fringe, just grassroots donors who gave $5 at a time. But the framing had already done the work. She'd stumbled through her answer, heart pounding, blinking too often. And when the segment ended, they handed her a tissue as if she'd been messy. She didn't cry, but something in her had cracked that day. Something about trust. Since then, she had watched it happen to others, time after time. Nina Turner, Ilhan Omar, even Michelle Obama in her early years. Women who walked in ready to speak policy, but were instead asked to justify their tone, their looks, their right to take up space. Always live, always with a smile, and always edited just enough to preserve plausible deniability. So when The View's invitation promised coziness, she didn't hear warmth. She heard setup. Her team kept reviewing talking points, economic indicators, polling trends, childcare reform wins. But a part of her wasn't listening. She was watching, again, that viral clip of an author she admired, flinching when asked if she was angry by nature. The clip cut right before her comeback. The version that aired never showed her full sentence, just her pause. That pause was enough to shape public opinion. AOC gently closed the binder. She stared at the yellow lamplight spilling onto the corner of her notepad. Her pen had left a short note there the night before. Half asleep, she'd written it in the dark. "They don't need a scandal, just a silence they can shape." It wasn't paranoia, it was memory. Still, she knew she couldn't back down. The most dangerous thing wasn't being misunderstood. It was disappearing from the conversation entirely. And if they were trying to soften her into silence, that meant one thing: her voice still mattered. She started again, this time with sharper questions for herself. Not what do I say if they go off script, but what do I do when they want the moment more than the message? She learned to recognize that glint in a host's eye, the one that says, "We're not here for your truth, we're here for our ratings." A breeze stirred the curtain beside her. She glanced outside. Somewhere in America, a girl was getting ready for school. Maybe the first in her family to speak up in a classroom. Maybe the first to realize that the world wouldn't always clap when she told the truth. And if AOC didn't show up now, fully prepared, fully awake, what message would that girl hear? She picked up her pen again, drew a box around the note she'd written earlier, then underlined it twice. Be clear, be calm, be uneditable. And just like that, the nerves didn't go away, but they became useful. Not fear, focus. The air in the studio smelled like too much hairspray and just enough nerves. She'd been in rooms like this before, rooms with too many mirrors, too many smiles, and not enough truth. But this one felt quieter, not in a peaceful way, but like a hush that had been placed there on purpose. A production assistant walked her to the green room. On the surface, everything was as promised: fresh fruit, herbal tea, a printed run of show with color-coded cues. Her name was there, highlighted in gold. She studied the segment outline. First, Women in Power, Generational Impact, followed by Latina Leadership in Washington. Both topics had been pre-cleared, safe, broad, predictable. But something was off. There was a sticky note on the printed schedule. Someone had scribbled in a name, Megan L., replacing Sarah H. The handwriting was quick, rushed. AOC narrowed her eyes. Megan wasn't originally listed, and Megan didn't ask questions. She provoked. Her chief of staff entered moments later, tablet in hand. "They didn't tell us about the change," she said, voice low. "No email, no heads up." She tapped the screen, pulling up a time-stamped agenda from just 2 days ago. Sarah was still confirmed. AOC nodded. She was already slipping into a different kind of calm, the kind that meant observation first, reaction later. Backstage, she could hear the warm-up comedian getting the crowd to cheer louder. "Let's give it up for real women in charge," he shouted. A burst of applause followed. A producer poked her head in. "5 minutes. You're up after break." She stood smoothing the lapel of her slate blue blazer, the one she always wore when she needed to look unshaken, even when the ground moved. Just before stepping out, her phone buzzed in her bag. She glanced down and caught the preview of a text. "Chief of Staff. This feels coordinated. Be careful." The message landed harder than it should have, not because it was surprising, but because it named what she had already begun to feel. In the hallway, she passed a wall of photos. Every famous guest over the past 10 years. Smiling, waving, airbrushed and edited. For a moment, she wondered how many of them had been invited to be seen, not heard. She entered the stage just as the lights dimmed and the audience cheered on cue. Megan L. stood from her seat and offered a handshake that felt like a performance. Her smile was bright, but her eyes didn't match. They sat. The segment producer counted them down. The teleprompter glowed with the same words her team had received, at least on the surface. The show began as expected. Softball questions, nods to her background, applause lines about young women in politics. But even as she spoke, she noticed Megan flipping her note cards under the table, as if searching for a different cue. The host to her left fidgeted. A subtle hand signal was exchanged between a producer and someone off stage. Something had shifted. She didn't know what yet, but she knew enough to recognize the quiet before a wave crests. Her fingers tapped gently against her knee, a rhythm she hadn't noticed until now. By the third question, she'd stopped looking at the cue cards entirely, because when they changed the script, they forgot one thing. She never needed one to begin with. It began like any other segment, with a warm laugh, a compliment, and a polished let-in. The lights weren't too harsh. The mugs were pre-filled with untouched tea, and the co-host smiled in that way that made everything feel casual, almost intimate. AOC sat between them, shoulders upright but no longer tense. For a moment, it did feel genuine. The first question came from the left, a soft lob about student loan forgiveness. "You've been vocal on this," the host said, tilting her head slightly. "And a lot of young people say they finally feel seen. What's the next step?" AOC nodded, grateful to start with substance. "We've made progress, yes, but visibility doesn't pay bills. We're not just erasing debt, we're investing in potential." The audience applauded. Briefly, she felt the rhythm settle. She glanced into the crowd and caught sight of an older woman in the third row, nodding slowly, hands folded tightly in her lap. That kind of presence was what kept her grounded. People who didn't clap because they agreed, but because they understood. Next came a question about TikTok bans and data privacy. A little sharper, but still in the expected range. AOC replied with ease, pointing out the need to balance national security with protecting digital expression. "The issue," she said calmly, "is that we can't treat surveillance concerns as neutral when enforcement rarely is." Laughter trickled in when one of the co-hosts joked about TikTok trends. "I still don't know what a duet is," she said, and the audience chuckled. AOC smiled too, grateful for the brief levity. The table felt less like a trap and more like a dialogue. That's how they build comfort, layer by layer, not with deceit, but with familiarity. Between takes, producers hovered just off stage, pretending to fix microphones that didn't need fixing. A card was handed to Megan L., quick and quiet. AOC noticed the switch, but didn't react. You don't flinch when the camera's rolling. You learn to store the questions for later. By the third topic, women's financial literacy, AOC relaxed just slightly. She spoke about her time bartending, how she learned more about money from tips and rent stress than any Econ 101 course. The audience clapped again, not the performative kind, but something warmer. She could feel her voice finding its balance between conviction and calm. Then came the turn, the kind you don't see until it's too late to step back from it. Megan leaned forward, resting her hand gently on her note cards. Her smile didn't change. Her tone stayed soft. But her eyes had shifted, focused like the lens of a camera zooming in, just a little too tight. AOC sensed it, not in the words yet, but in the air itself. Like a room where the temperature drops 1 degree too fast. The host on her right subtly adjusted her posture. The one across from her stopped fidgeting altogether. Something had been cued. AOC placed her hand on the table, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of her cup. Her breathing slowed. She kept her expression neutral, composed. Not because she wasn't ready, but because she was. Because sometimes calm isn't comfort. Sometimes calm is just the space right before someone decides to strike. And in that pause before the next question was asked, she knew the real segment was about to begin. It came so cleanly, so quietly, that for a split second it didn't even register as an ambush. They had just wrapped a segment on housing equity. AOC had made a point about how policies often overlook the working class, especially immigrant families who contribute but are rarely acknowledged. The audience nodded, some clapped, a few leaned in. Megan L. waited, eyes still, fingers calmly resting on her card stack, and then, without any cue from the teleprompter, cut in. "Speaking of immigrant families," she said, voice light but aimed, "did your mother come here illegally?" The air didn't move. AOC didn't blink, but her breath caught at the edge of her rib cage. Megan went on like she was finishing a recipe. "Because if so, wouldn't that explain why you're often so lenient on criminals?" Silence dropped like a curtain. It wasn't the kind of silence that comes from confusion. It was the silence of people who knew exactly what had just been said and didn't know what to do with it. The audience froze, unsure if they were supposed to react. Viewers at home reached for their remotes, suddenly hyper-aware of the moment. The studio lights didn't flicker, but something dimmed in the energy around the table. AOC sat very still. This wasn't a tough question. It wasn't even a question in the real sense. It was an accusation dressed in curiosity, a wound poked at in public, layered with implications not about policy, but about blood, about worth, about belonging. She waited a full breath, not to gather herself, she was already gathered, but to give everyone else time to hear what had just been said. Then with a calm so steady it landed like thunder, she spoke. "You don't get to reduce women to where they were born," she said, eyes locked on Megan's, "or what they survived." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. It wasn't built to entertain or retaliate. It was built to remind the room that this was never supposed to be part of the script. Another pause. The co-host shifted. Someone offstage signaled, unsure whether to cut to commercial. A crew member hesitated, headset in hand. But Megan didn't say anything else. She simply held her smile, frozen now like a screen on pause. AOC continued, not to retaliate, but to reclaim the space that had just been twisted. "My mother raised me to clean houses before she ever dreamed her daughter would write laws," she said. "And what she taught me wasn't leniency. It was the difference between someone who breaks the law and someone the law was built to break." The audience inhaled, slow, sharp, collective. Not everyone clapped. Some didn't know how, but no one looked away. On the surface, the show moved on. The next co-host asked a vague follow-up about community outreach. The lights stayed warm, the cameras kept rolling, but something had shifted beneath the table. The warmth was gone. The illusion had cracked. AOC didn't shrink. She adjusted her posture, steady, and kept her eyes soft. Not angry, not flustered, just present. And somewhere deep in the control room, someone realized the ambush didn't land. It revealed. The applause came right on cue. It wasn't enthusiastic, but it was loud, like a curtain trying to fall quickly, to cover something everyone had just witnessed but no one wanted to explain. The host smiled too widely. The producers flashed clap signs just a little too long. The studio lights held steady, but they felt brighter now, as if exposing more than just skin. AOC stood when the segment ended. She nodded politely, shook the hand that was extended to her, Megan's fingers cold and a little too firm, and exited stage left without a word. Her face didn't break. No tightness around the jaw, no visible irritation, just a stillness so practiced it could be mistaken for peace. The hallway back to the green room felt longer than it had on the way in. The once chatty production staff didn't make eye contact. Someone muttered, "Great segment," but it landed flat, like small talk at the wrong funeral. Inside the dressing room, the door clicked shut behind her. Her chief of staff looked up from her phone, brow already furrowed. "They set you up," she said plainly. "That wasn't on the rundown. That question wasn't in any version of the brief." AOC removed her blazer with slow, deliberate movements. She draped it over the back of the chair, then sat and looked into the mirror. Not to fix anything, but to watch herself. Her own eyes, still steady, still there. "I know," she said quietly. "Let's find the receipts." Her comms director pulled out a folder, already thick with printed emails and annotated production notes. "We logged every communication from their team. I'm going to double-check the timestamps and compare the final version they sent this morning." AOC didn't respond right away. She reached for a makeup wipe and gently removed the foundation from one cheek, then the other. Underneath the broadcast polish was the face people didn't always get to see, the one that had weathered headlines, hearings, and everything in between, the one that wasn't camera-ready but was always truth-ready. Behind her, her policy advisor spoke up. The phrasing, "Did your mother come here illegally?" that wasn't just offensive. It was crafted. It sounded rehearsed. "I agree," her chief of staff added. "That wasn't improvisation. That was planted." AOC stood and stretched slowly. Her body ached in small, subtle ways. Not from stress exactly, more from containment, the way it feels when you have to hold everything in place while people try to bend it out of shape. "I want the off-air audio pulled," she said, her tone still calm. "Studio mics don't cut immediately after segments. There's usually a 5-second bleed." "Get that." Her team exchanged glances. They'd seen her fired up before, but this wasn't fire. This was frost. Controlled. Focused. Dangerous in the way that made strategists seem sit up straight. "Also," she added, reaching for her bag, "cross-reference their sponsor list with recent PAC activity." "Super PACs?" "No," she said, grabbing her phone. "Start with media partners. Trace the funding lines. If this was coordinated, someone got paid to keep it quiet." She paused at the mirror again, this time not to observe but to decide. "They wanted a soundbite," she said finally. "Now we give them a timeline." From outside the door came the sound of another segment beginning. Laughter, applause, another guest being welcomed on air. Inside, the room stayed quiet. No more clapping, no more makeup. Just a congresswoman, a cold file of receipts beginning to pile up, and a team who suddenly understood. They hadn't watched her get ambushed. They just watched her begin to build the counterattack. It was nearly midnight when the file came through. The office had mostly cleared out, but AOC's team worked late when instinct said something wasn't finished. Her tech aide, Gabriel, had been combing through raw footage all afternoon, studio feeds, press streams, even off-air segments captured accidentally on backup servers. Most of it was unremarkable. Chatter, mic checks, hosts discussing coffee orders. But just as he was about to close his laptop, he found a clip labeled "Green Room Audio Track B-Raw." No timestamp, no transcript. He clicked play. At first, only background noise, shuffling papers, low voices, someone coughing. Then clearer, a producer's voice, casual but focused. "Let's put it right after the laugh break." "She'll be more relaxed then." Another voice replied, lighter, almost amused. "She won't see it coming." Gabriel froze. He replayed the clip 3 times, isolating the voices. The names weren't spoken, but he recognized the cadence. One belonged to the segment's assistant producer. The other, Megan's. He didn't wait. He sent the file straight to AOC's secure inbox with a simple subject line. "You need to hear this." The next morning, AOC sat alone in her office. The sun was just beginning to color the edge of the Capitol dome outside her window, a soft orange brushing against the stone. She hadn't touched her tea. The screen in front of her glowed in silence. She pressed play. The voices came clearly now. Let's time it after the laugh break. She won't see it coming. No script, no debate, just precision. It wasn't just the words, it was the tone. That casual, practiced ease of people who'd done this before. People who knew exactly how to land a question that wasn't meant to enlighten, but to provoke, to shrink. She sat back in her chair and stared at the screen. No anger on her face, no shock, just stillness. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't a rogue host. It was deliberate. And yet, as she listened again, she noticed something else, something quieter than the words themselves. A short pause between the comments, and then the faint sound of laughter in the distance. Probably a tech rehearsing the studio timing. Probably someone who had no idea they were working beside a setup. That made it worse, because ambushes are one thing, but ambushes done in rooms with snacks and branded mugs and girl power banners hanging off the cameras. Those are harder to name, harder to prove, and even harder to make people care about, until now. She called her chief of staff. "We have confirmation," she said plainly, "and we have tone." "What's the plan?" her staffer asked. "We don't go public yet," AOC said, "but we build the spine of the story." She copied the audio to a secure drive, created a new folder, labeled it Episode Breakdown, Internal Only. Inside, she wrote a short note to her team. "This is not just about what they said, it's about what they designed. This wasn't journalism, it was performance, with targets." Then she closed the file, stood, and finally sipped her now lukewarm tea. Out the window, the dome brightened fully into view, and behind her, on the desk, the soundbite looped again, soft but undeniable. She won't see it coming. But now she had. It started with a receipt. Not the kind you keep in a wallet, but the kind buried inside public filings that most people never read. A late-night intern had been combing through FEC records, not because anyone told her to, but because something about the timing didn't sit right. She was the daughter of a librarian and a long-haul trucker, raised to trust patterns and question coincidences. What she found was small, but telling. 10 days before AOC's appearance on The View, a sizable donation, 6 figures, had been made to one of the show's primary corporate sponsors. On paper, it looked like a standard political contribution to a media engagement fund. But the donor? A right-wing super PAC known for bankrolling attack ads against female progressive candidates, specifically women of color. She sent the link up the chain with a single sentence. "This might be nothing, or it might be everything." By noon, AOC's team was digging deeper. The PAC's financial patterns revealed a clear strategy: high visibility moments, time drops, indirect influence through third-party media partnerships. They didn't run their own ads anymore. They didn't need to. They funded enhanced editorial framing. In one cycle, they'd supported a documentary about urban crime patterns that subtly smeared reform-minded DAs. In another, they sponsored a digital campaign to highlight bias in liberal women's leadership, pushing talking points into morning news segments without ever putting their name on screen. This time, it wasn't just a sponsorship, it was timing and silence. 10 days before air, the PAC wired funds to the parent company of The View's main advertiser, under a general category labeled Civic Engagement Outreach. That same week, 2 segment producers at the show were reassigned, and a new senior editor with known ties to conservative think tanks was quietly brought in as a consultant. No press release, no public announcement, but the pieces were there, if you knew where to look. AOC sat with her policy lead, the folder open between them. She flipped through the printouts, highlighting the trail with a quiet kind of focus. Not fury, just clarity. "They didn't come for me directly," she said. "They bought the room." Her staffer nodded. They didn't need to change the show. They just needed to change who was holding the mic. There was something chilling about it, not because it was new, but because it was so ordinary, so polished. Money wrapped in language, influence disguised as format. And it always moved the same way, just far enough from the public eye to feel invisible. just clean enough to be deniable. But this time, someone was watching. Later that evening, AOC drafted a memo for internal use. A few paragraphs, crisp, factual. What we're looking at is the slow privatization of public trust. It's not just media bias, it's media leasing. Segments sold to the highest bidder, then dressed in neutral tones. They didn't fund a smear ad. They funded the pause before the question. She paused after typing that line, then added, "We respond not with outrage, but with evidence." She saved the file, marked it private, and sent it to 2 advisors with one word in the subject line: unmasking. As the office dimmed around her, she looked out toward the Capitol, its lights already glowing, the facade clean and white and still. But she knew better. She knew what could be buried under polish. She turned back to the folder, not to close it, but to keep going. There was no press conference, no viral thread, no scathing Instagram caption. Just a white envelope on thick paper delivered by hand to ABC News legal department at 10:42 a.m., bearing the seal of a congressional office and the signature of a woman who had chosen silence, but not surrender. Inside was a formal request for internal communications surrounding the segment in question. Emails, meeting minutes, segment drafts, producer notes, payment logs tied to external consultants in the 14 days prior to air. The language was measured, no accusations, no dramatics, just a calm invocation of ethics, responsibility, and the right to transparency when a public official is invited under false pretenses to a platform that reaches millions. Across the table, her legal counsel exhaled quietly after sealing the letter. This opens a door. Once it's in writing, they can't pretend it didn't happen. AOC nodded. She wasn't new to doors. She just preferred to walk through them when the other side wasn't expecting it. Her team waited. Some expected a social media rollout, maybe a hint dropped in a quote to a friendly reporter. But AOC didn't move toward the camera this time. She moved toward paper, procedure. The things people forget can still shift the ground beneath institutions. If they were willing to weaponize a show, she said softly, then let's show them what accountability looks like. In the hours that followed, a few things began to stir. Not in public, but in inboxes and legal offices. A junior executive at ABC flagged the letter internally. The show's lead producer scheduled an emergency meeting. A legal rep emailed back a request for clarification, hoping to slow things down. They received a second envelope the next morning. This one included an annotated timeline of donor activity, links to public PAC disclosures, and a breakdown of internal staffing shifts leading up to the segment. Every fact sourced. Every implication supported. Nothing inflammatory, just precise. By the end of the week, her team had submitted a formal ethics inquiry to the House Committee on Oversight, citing a need to explore the intersection of media influence and political coordination. Quietly, thoroughly, without asking for a headline. Because some storms don't need thunder, they just need to arrive. At her office that Friday evening, the mood was quiet but focused. The folder marked unmasking was thicker now. Her chief of staff laid it on the table between them, next to 2 cups of chamomile tea. "We're going to get blowback," her comms director said. "They'll say you're overreacting, that this is just TV." AOC looked up from her notes. "It was never just TV," she replied. "It was airtime, and they sold it with my name on it." She turned back to the folder, slipping in the latest printout, a list of producers' names next to unexplained transfers from shell LLCs tied to messaging firms. "It's not about scandal," she added. "It's about precedent. They need to know this kind of thing doesn't go unnoticed just because the lights are warm and the chairs are upholstered." The room was still for a moment. Then someone in her team smiled faintly. "So what do we call this phase?" AOC tilted her head thoughtfully. "We don't," she said. "Let them name it when the story changes." And just like that, a new kind of fight had begun, not with slogans or microphones, but with footnotes, timelines, and the quiet confidence of someone who knew that real power didn't come from being loud. It came from being right and being ready. The podium looked ordinary, standard seal, worn marble steps, 2 standing mics, but the air around it felt different. Capitol Hill had hosted hundreds of press conferences, but this one wasn't about a vote, or a scandal, or a headline someone had spun out of shape. This one was quiet, even as the cameras crowded in. Even as a dozen news vans idled on the curb, their satellites tilted upward like question marks waiting to be answered. AOC stepped to the microphone just after 10 a.m., flanked by her legal counsel and her communications director, both holding folders thick with documentation, but saying nothing. The sun was high, the air crisp, the mood tense but expectant. She didn't start with anger or accusation. She started with clarity. For years, she said evenly, I've walked into interviews knowing the risks. I've faced panels that didn't want conversation, only confrontation. And I've accepted that because sometimes that's the cost of being visible. She paused, her eyes scanning the rows of reporters, some already typing, others simply watching. But there is a line, she continued, between discomfort and design, between disagreement and orchestration. Then came the part that wasn't on the press release, the sentence no one had prepared for, because it hadn't been rehearsed. It had just lived inside her for days, waiting. I don't fight talk shows. I fight with truth. The words landed with weight, not volume. They didn't shout. They didn't posture. They simply held their ground. The questions started before she'd even finished. Congresswoman, is this about ratings manipulation? Are you accusing the View of political coordination? Do you believe this was targeted because of your background? She raised a hand, not to silence, but to shape. We are filing a formal legal action, she said, naming both ABC and its affiliate sponsors as parties to a coordinated effort to distort, defame, and damage. The evidence includes internal production records, financial transactions tied to politically motivated PACs, and a deliberate deviation from the agreed interview terms. This wasn't journalism. It was performance with a purpose. Behind her, the legal counsel passed out printed briefs, carefully structured, thoroughly sourced. The front page read, Complaint, Deliberate Defamation, Political Collusion, and Breach of Public Trust. And just beneath that, a quote from her opening remarks, Silence is not my brand. Evidence is, it took minutes, maybe less, for the line to hit the internet. Screens lit up from Brooklyn to Bakersfield. News tickers flashed it across the bottom of daytime segments. Commentators debated whether she'd gone too far before reading even a sentence of the brief. But among older viewers, the ones who'd sat through the ambush live, who'd watched the smirk on Meganelle's face, who had daughters or nieces or granddaughters who'd once been told to calm down when they spoke plainly, it struck something deeper. A caller on a local radio show in Ohio said it best. She didn't yell. She didn't whine. She just brought her receipts and said, Now we begin. That's the kind of calm that makes people nervous. Back on the Capitol steps, AOC took one last question, soft-spoken from a reporter in the back. What made you decide to go public with this now? She tilted her head slightly, not with defiance, but with quiet conviction. Because truth doesn't defend itself. Someone has to stand beside it. And then she stepped away from the mic, not to escape the noise, but to let the record speak louder. The first wave came quickly and predictably. By noon, conservative talk shows were already rolling out the same script, dressed in slightly different suits. AOC can dish it, but she can't take it, said one host with a practiced smirk. Another declared, Since when is asking a tough question a crime? The word fragile was passed around like candy. Never shouted, but always implied. The headlines followed suit. Congresswoman melts down over TV segment. Woke war on free press. When did politics get so thin-skinned? But beyond the usual channels, something else was happening. In living rooms across the country, longtime viewers of The View, especially older women who had followed the show since its early days, sat with furrowed brows and crossed arms. They weren't scrolling Twitter. They were remembering what they saw and what they didn't. I've watched that show for 20 years, one woman wrote in a letter to her local paper in Minnesota. I may not always agree with Representative Ocasio-Cortez, but what happened to her wasn't conversation. It was cornering. Another wrote in a Facebook post that spread quietly across retirement forums and garden groups. I tuned in expecting to hear about policy. Instead, I watched a woman get baited about her mother's immigration status in front of millions. That's not tough journalism. That's something else. The show's audience was older. Loyal, not easily rattled, but not easily fooled either. And while many didn't follow AOC's politics closely, they knew what they saw. And it didn't feel right. Then quietly, a clip began to circulate. Not from the lawsuit, not from the press conference, but from a former co-host. It was a short video filmed in her home office, just her and her webcam. She didn't speak as a partisan. She didn't even name names. She simply said, "There's a difference between asking a real question and staging a moment." What happened to her wasn't journalism. It was a hit job. No music, no edits. Just a calm, steady voice that cut through the noise. Within 24 hours, it had 2 million views. Meanwhile, editorial rooms were scrambling. ABC released a brief, carefully worded statement reaffirming its commitment to editorial independence. But they didn't deny the allegations. They didn't acknowledge the emails. They didn't address the funding trail. Other networks picked up the silence and filled it. Panel shows debated whether politics was infecting entertainment. News columnists wrote about the ethics of platforming elected officials under manipulated conditions. One centrist commentator wrote, "You don't have to like her politics to admit something stunk about that segment." And then came the quiet shift in tone. A syndicated newspaper in Pennsylvania ran a Sunday op-ed titled, "Maybe She Was Right to Walk Out Calmly." In Florida, a local anchor compared the moment to watching a high school teacher get interrupted mid-lesson by a student looking to go viral. Not outrage, not fanfare, just discomfort. Inside AOC's office, the team tracked the responses in silence. The backlash had arrived, yes, but not against them. Not this time. Her comms director smiled softly. "They tried to write her out of the moment," she said, scrolling, "but people keep writing her back in." AOC glanced up from her notes. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't tired either. "They made it about me," she said quietly, "but it never was." She turned back to the draft in front of her, a request for raw studio footage, audio logs, and production records. There were more questions to be asked, and now more people asking them. The conference room on the 19th floor wasn't designed for damage control. It was meant for contract renewals, content rollouts, quarterly champagne toasts. But on this particular night, it felt more like a bunker. The lights were too bright, the coffee too bitter, and the silence between executives too loud to ignore. They'd already pushed 2 other meetings off the calendar. One senior VP was still in a wrinkled suit from his morning commute. Another had kicked off her heels hours ago, now pacing in socks by the glass wall, holding her phone like it might bite her. The press statement had gone out earlier, clean and cautious, but it hadn't stopped the bleed. A social media manager, young and exhausted, entered with a fresh batch of analytics. The clip of the press conference is at 7.1 million views. Engagement skews older. Over 60% are 50 and up. Someone at the table muttered, "Our core demographic." The head of legal pinched the bridge of his nose. "We gave her a segment, not a subpoena. Why does this feel like we're on trial?" Another executive pulled up a spreadsheet. "Because she brought facts, not fury, and now we're the ones reacting emotionally." No one laughed, not even out of habit. At 11:03 p.m., a message popped up in the internal group chat used by senior producers. It was short, unfiltered, not meant to be seen by the outside world. "We didn't expect her to fight back this hard." 2 minutes later, someone tried to delete it, but not before a screenshot was taken. By morning, it would find its way to a freelance journalist in DC, the kind who knew how to follow a leak without torching their source. Inside the room, though, the damage was still unfolding slowly, quietly. They reviewed the timeline again. The PAC donations, the internal staff reshuffles, the editorial shifts. It didn't look like sabotage on paper, but in the court of public perception, it didn't have to. "She's making this about process," or said the executive in socks, "which means we can't argue it's personal." She, the marketing director, added, "She's letting the public connect the dots. We're the ones looking defensive." The room sat with that. Then came the harder question. "Do we risk more by ignoring her?" someone asked, "or by engaging directly?" Silence. Eventually, the answer came from a quiet voice near the end of the table. A woman who had worked at the network for 23 years. She spoke gently, like she was stating something she'd known for a while. "She doesn't want airtime," she said. She wants integrity back in it, and we gave her the perfect case study. No one argued, they just shifted in their chairs. Downstairs, the building's lights began to dim for the night, except on the 19th floor. They stayed lit long past midnight, not because anyone had a solution, but because they all understood the same thing. The damage wasn't in the question that had been asked on air. It was in everything that had been set up around it, and everything that had been uncovered since. And now the one person they thought would walk away quietly had forced them to sit still and listen. They began arriving slowly, tucked among policy reports and budget memos. A few envelopes at first, cream-colored, smudged with weather and ink. Then more, stacked in small bundles by her assistant's desk. Not tweets, not hashtags, but handwriting. Some shaky, some careful, all deliberate. AOC opened the first one on a Thursday morning, the kind of day that felt suspended, caught between hearings and headlines. The envelope had no return address, just a name, June R. in neat cursive. Inside was a short note written on lined paper, folded once down the center. My granddaughter watched that segment with me. She's 9. She asked why they were so mean to you. I didn't know what to tell her, but I told her you stayed calm, and that mattered. No political affiliation, no call to action, just that. She set the letter down, eyes soft, then opened another. I may not agree with everything you stand for. I'm a lifelong Republican, but I know what it looks like when someone gets ambushed. And that wasn't okay. The words were underlined, that wasn't okay. It echoed longer than expected. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was rare. Agreement wasn't required, just recognition. More letters followed, some from teachers who'd paused mid-lesson to talk to students about dignity, others from older viewers who had watched The View since its early seasons. We were taught to respect guests, even ones we didn't understand. You reminded me of my sister, quiet when cornered, then stronger after. You didn't flinch. That taught my sons more than any debate could. Her legislative director began organizing them into a binder, unprompted. They called it The Other Audience, a quiet tribute to people who weren't writing op-eds or giving interviews, just slipping folded thoughts into mailboxes and trusting they'd land somewhere that mattered. And they did. One envelope came with a drawing, a child's crayon sketch of a woman at a table, sitting tall while others frown around her. At the top, in blue marker, Miss AOC stands up by sitting still. The child had written her name in big letters, Marisol, age 7. AOC stared at it longer than she meant to. There was something about children watching a moment not meant for them, watching it and drawing clarity from it anyway. It was humbling and heavy. She pinned the drawing inside her office cabinet near a quiet corner where no cameras ever looked. One afternoon, her mother called. They hadn't spoken about the segment since the lawsuit began. It had become too noisy, too public. But this time, her mother's voice was different. Less guarded, more still. I read a letter from a woman in Detroit, she said. She said you didn't raise your voice because you were raised to use it carefully. A pause. I knew I raised you strong. I just didn't know people would notice it like that. AOC closed her eyes, not because she was overwhelmed, but because she understood something deeper. This moment wasn't just reaction. It was reflection, and reflection was often quiet. Back at her desk, she held another envelope. The handwriting looked familiar. Inside, a simple sentence. They tried to make you a soundbite, but you became a mirror. She read it twice, then folded it again and placed it between 2 case files on immigration reform. Because somewhere, someone was still watching, still learning, and if they were going to write her into their living rooms, into their conversations, into the questions their children asked at dinner, then she would write back, not always with words, sometimes just by staying. The train ride back felt quieter than usual, even with the usual hum of motion and stray conversations bouncing between cars. AOC kept her coat folded across her lap and her phone in her pocket, resisting the urge to check headlines or inboxes. There would be time for all that, but not now, not here. She stepped off at the same stop she used to take home from work, back when late nights meant wiping down counters and calculating tips that would barely stretch through the weekend. The platform still smelled faintly of warm concrete and corner pretzels. Familiar, undramatic, human. Walking up the block, she passed the old bodega with the dented soda fridge still humming in the front window. The mural by the auto shop hadn't changed, still bold reds and deep blues, still chipped in one corner. She hadn't walked this route in months, maybe longer, and yet her feet didn't hesitate. They remembered. Then came the corner restaurant, the one with the faded red awning and the narrow front door that used to stick in summer. Her old job. 2 years behind that bar, pouring coffee and mezcal, serving every kind of tired person in the city, nurses on double shifts, teachers correcting papers on napkins, night workers looking for something that felt like home at 1 a.m. She paused in front of the window. The same chalkboard menu stood outside, now featuring seasonal specials written in new handwriting. Through the glass, she saw someone clearing a table with the same rhythm she used to carry, efficient, invisible. A kind of grace no one teaches, but necessity perfects. She didn't go inside. Instead, she kept walking. A few steps down the block, a voice called from behind, soft but direct. "Alexandria?" She turned. An older woman, maybe late 60s, stood holding a canvas shopping bag, her coat open just enough to reveal a Mets t-shirt underneath. Her eyes were sharp, kind, and completely unafraid. "I knew it was you," she said, stepping closer. "I used to see you around here years ago. Same walk? Same look like you're carrying something bigger than the bag in your hand?" AOC smiled gently. "Nice to see you again." The woman nodded. "I watched that whole mess on TV. Thought I'd feel angry, but I didn't. I just kept wondering how you didn't flinch." She paused, adjusting the strap on her shoulder. "They didn't expect you to stay calm. That's what scared them most." AOC didn't reply right away. The breeze picked up, carrying the faint scent of grilled onions and warm bread from a nearby cart. The world kept moving. "They wanted you to snap," the woman added, eyes steady now. "Would have been easier to write you off if you did. But you didn't give them what they came for." AOC exhaled slowly. "I just tried to stay still." The woman smiled, not out of politeness but in quiet solidarity. "Well," she said, reaching into her bag for a loaf of bread wrapped in deli paper. "Stillness can be loud too, when it's the right kind." She gave a small wave, turned and disappeared into the apartment entrance behind her. AOC stood alone for a moment longer, then turned back toward the station. No photos, no notes taken, just steps retraced. She wasn't there to be seen. She was there to remember. And sometimes that was the clearest kind of strength, the kind built not in the spotlight, but in the quiet streets that taught you how to hold your ground without raising your voice. The email came just after noon on a Tuesday. No fanfare, no urgent headline, just a calendar update in the inbox marked "Confirmed Preliminary Hearing, U.S. District Court, Civil Docket Number 12844F. Her legal counsel didn't celebrate. They simply forwarded the notice with a 2-word subject line. "It's time." The discovery requests had been delivered that morning. Clean, thorough, patient. Dozens of documents requested, including internal memos, scheduling logs, editorial chains, and financial disclosures from affiliate sponsors tied to the segment's production window. There were no threats in the language, no spikes of emotion, just one clear message. We are watching, and we will wait for the truth. AOC read it in silence. Her thumb hovered over her phone before she finally locked the screen and slipped it into her desk drawer. The click of the drawer landing shut felt oddly final, like a door closing behind her, but not in loss, in readiness. That night her mother arrived in D.C. She had insisted on taking the bus from New York, said she liked the quiet hum of the road, the slow unfolding of distance. AOC met her at Union Station in sneakers and a borrowed coat. They didn't say much during the walk to her apartment. Just enough to stay close, just enough to stay real. Back home, her mother unpacked soup she'd made, chicken with squash, cilantro, and garlic, the kind that stuck to your bones and made everything ache a little less. She didn't ask about the case, didn't mention the news, just ladled the soup into bowls, set them down, and asked softly, "You sleeping okay?" AOC nodded, even if it wasn't completely true. Later, while she sat on the edge of her bed, towel wrapped around her shoulders, her mother came in holding an old wooden brush. "You used to hate this," she said, smiling gently, "but it always made you still." She brushed her daughter's hair slowly, rhythmically, the way she had during childhood when the world outside felt too loud and the future too unknown. The strokes were soft but steady, the kind that weren't just about grooming, but grounding. "You've always carried a lot," her mother whispered, brushing through another knot. "Even when you were little, you acted like the world was already watching." She paused then, setting the brush down for a moment, and placed both hands on AOC's shoulders. "But now the whole country knows it. And I need you to remember, before any of this, you were mine. You're still my girl. You hear me?" AOC closed her eyes just for a second, not because she was tired, because sometimes when everything outside is so loud, you need the simplest truths to be spoken aloud, to be reminded of who you were before you had to become all the rest. The next morning, she left the apartment early. Her mother was still sleeping, curled beneath the quilt she insisted on bringing from home. AOC stepped into the cool morning air, coffee in hand, coat zipped high. She walked toward the Capitol not with the urgency of defense, but with the quiet steadiness of someone who no longer needed to prove anything. The trial was coming. The case was real. But the calm inside her had already arrived. And somewhere along the way, between the brushstrokes, the letters, the steps through her neighborhood, she had remembered something more powerful than victory. She had remembered herself, and that was enough to make her smile. The morning began like most others on Capitol Hill. Guards at the door, coffee already cooling in paper cups, staffers whispering behind folders. But there was a wait in the hallway leading to the hearing room. Not the chaotic kind that swells around scandals or leaks, but the quieter kind. The kind that signals something long ignored was finally about to be named. The hearing was scheduled under the banner of the House Subcommittee on Media Ethics and Public Accountability. The room wasn't packed with press the way high-profile trials might be, but it was full in the way that mattered. Older viewers watching from home, teachers recording the session for class discussion, retired journalists paying close attention to a system they once believed in. AOC arrived in navy, no bold color, no flashy pin, just the quiet steadiness of someone who had come not to retaliate, but to record the truth. She took her seat, offered a nod to the chair, and waited her turn. The witnesses before her gave measured remarks, former producers, media analysts, even a communications ethics professor who outlined the growing trend of political money slipping quietly into entertainment framing. When her name was called, the room shifted. Not in volume, in attention. She didn't start with the segment, or the lawsuit, or even her own story. She started with a woman named Letitia from Milwaukee who had written her a letter weeks earlier. Letitia was 67, a grandmother of 5, who said she'd never written to a politician in her life. But she'd written to AOC after watching The View and seeing something she couldn't explain to her granddaughter: why a woman of color, speaking softly, was treated like a threat. AOC held that letter in her hand as she began to speak. "This hearing isn't about a show," she said, voice even. "It's about something far more dangerous, the quiet normalization of distortion, disguised as conversation." She looked across the panel. Not with challenge, but with invitation. This wasn't just bad behavior. It was a deliberate distortion, and it's part of a pattern, one where media platforms appear neutral, but operate with hidden motives, pressured by funding, shaped by donor strategy, masked by smiles. She laid the letter gently on the desk. Millions of Americans still believe what they see on daytime television is unfiltered, unproduced, untainted. But we know better now. What happened wasn't a glitch. It was a model. And if we don't confront that model, we let trust erode in the spaces where people turn for clarity. The room stayed still. A few members of the committee scribbled notes. Others watched her closely. One tried to interject. An older representative, skeptical by habit. "Are you suggesting every editorial change is corruption?" She turned to him, calm. "No, Congressman. I'm saying when editorial changes align consistently with the political aims of undisclosed financial backers, that's no longer coincidence. It's capture, She let the words sit, not shouted, just placed. Behind her, the gallery of citizens remained hushed. But outside the hearing room, the ripple had already begun. Older viewers, many of whom had followed The View for years, began switching channels. Not with rage, but with quiet rejection. A subtle protest. A refusal to participate in a conversation they now felt had been scripted without their consent. Some wrote to their stations. Others called in to daytime radio shows. "She didn't accuse," one caller said. "She explained. That's rarer than it should be." After her testimony, AOC didn't stay to soak in reactions. She nodded to the committee, handed the letter back to her staffer, and exited through a side hallway. One young journalist, trailing behind the crowd, asked quietly, "Do you think anything will change?" AOC smiled faintly. "Change doesn't always start loud," she said. "Sometimes it starts with a pause." And in living rooms across the country, that pause had already begun. They didn't announce it with a press release. There was no primetime interview, no branded apology, no dramatic apology tour. The clip simply appeared, quietly mid-afternoon, on the network's website, tucked beneath the usual segments and celebrity interviews. The title was innocuous: Full Interview, Extended Version. But it didn't take long before people noticed. It spread like water slipping through cracks. Fast, quiet, unstoppable. At first glance, it looked like the same episode viewers had already seen. The same set, the same lighting, the same conversation. Or so they thought. But 5 minutes in, it changed. Because this time, the silences weren't edited. The pauses between AOC's words weren't tightened to make her sound defensive. Her full answers weren't clipped just before the punchline. The cutaways no longer skipped her expressions or the subtle shifts in her tone. In this version, she was whole. Viewers watched as she responded to the ambush question, not with a stammer or a stall, but with quiet control and layered thought. They heard the part that had been omitted, where she challenged the framing, redirected the conversation, and spoke about law, legacy, and dignity with the steadiness of someone who'd been here before. What they saw was not just the truth, it was the absence of manipulation. A side-by-side comparison emerged on YouTube that same evening, the broadcast edit next to the raw footage. It went viral within hours. Commentators, media critics, even retired producers began pointing out the subtle shifts in tone, the manufactured tension, the suspicious insert shots that made it seem like the room had turned on her faster than it actually did. The edits weren't illegal, but they were intentional, and now undeniable. In a quiet town in Ohio, a grandmother sat her granddaughter down and rewatched the interview with her. "See," she said, "that's what I meant. They didn't just interrupt her, they rearranged her." In Arizona, a retired journalism professor wrote a column titled, "What They Cut Reveals Who They Are." And across the country, longtime viewers began to turn inward, not in rage, but in reflection. "I trusted them," one man wrote in a letter to the station. "I believed what they showed me. Now I realize I wasn't just watching a show, I was watching a narrative." Inside AOC's office, the mood was quiet. The video played on a muted screen as staffers refreshed polling tabs and media dashboards. They weren't looking for victory, they were tracking response. By the end of the week, her approval rating among viewers over 50 had jumped 12 points. Not because she'd changed, but because people had seen what she'd been trying to show them all along. It wasn't about convincing anyone, her comms director said. It was about making sure they had the whole picture. Turns out, that was enough. AOC sat at her desk, rereading a letter that had arrived that morning. "I'm 71. I was ready to write you off as another loud voice. But then I watched what they didn't want me to see. And I realized, you weren't loud. You were just uncut." She folded the letter and tucked it into a drawer where she kept things that mattered. Notes, drawings, names she never wanted to forget. The network never commented publicly. Ratings dipped slightly, then more noticeably. One of the executive producers was reassigned to a different division. An internal ethics review was mentioned once, then quietly shelved. But the tape lived on. Clipped, reshared, reframed by classrooms, newsrooms, living rooms. And as the views climbed, one thing became clear. The truth hadn't needed embellishment. It had only needed to be shown in full. AOC didn't post a response. She didn't tweet a victory. She simply returned to work. Because once the edit is undone, the real message begins. It wasn't teased in advance. No press leaks, no exclusive interviews, no digital countdown. Just the usual opening jingle of The View, the familiar camera pan across the table, and a long-serving co-host seated quietly at the far end. Shoulders relaxed, but eyes already far away. The morning had started like any other. The usual headlines, light banter about a celebrity engagement, and a quick transition into mid-tier politics. The audience clapped on cue. The lighting was warm, the set untouched. But something in the room felt different, a kind of hush just beneath the performance. And then she spoke. Not in the middle of a debate, not during a heated segment, but between topics when the cameras were still rolling, but no one expected anything real to happen. I need to say something before we move on. A brief silence fell. One co-host glanced toward the producer's booth. Another froze mid-lip gloss. She turned slightly in her chair and looked directly into the lens. "I've been part of this table for a long time," she said gently, almost like she was confiding in a friend. "And I've always believed that what we do here matters. Conversation, disagreement, making space for difficult ideas." She paused, let the air settle. "But a few weeks ago, something happened on this show that I can't make peace with." The studio quieted. You could hear the rustle of someone adjusting a note card behind the camera. "I didn't join this show to become a tool," she said. "And I certainly didn't come here to watch a guest, an elected official, get treated like bait for ratings. No names, no theatrics, just truth, delivered plainly. She didn't deserve what happened, and I should have said something sooner." The room stayed still. It wasn't dramatic in volume, but it was seismic in intent. Not because it was a rebellion, but because it was a release. The kind of statement that only comes from someone who stayed long enough to see all the layers, both the polish and the pressure. She thanked the audience, thanked the staff, and announced simply that she would be stepping away at the end of the week. No bitterness, no scandal, just a quiet reclaiming of her own voice. By noon, the clip was everywhere, not from the official network account, but through screen recordings, reposts, stitched reactions. It spread faster than the ambush segment ever had. Not because it was designed to, but because people recognized the weight of something unscripted. "She told the truth," one user posted. Finally. Across group chats, message boards, and talk radio, the phrase that stuck wasn't about the resignation itself. It was the line, "She didn't deserve what happened." It resonated in a way the original question never could, because this wasn't a clash. It was clarity. For longtime viewers of The View, it stirred complicated emotions. People who had grown up with the show now questioned what else had gone unspoken. A former guest wrote on Twitter, "It takes more courage to stand up when you're inside the room than when you're locked outside of it." Respect in her office later that day, AOC watched the clip in full. No judgment, no satisfaction, just stillness. She didn't know the host well. They had only met briefly backstage that day. A handshake, a smile, the kind of interaction that gets buried under production schedules and stage directions. But now, months later, that same woman had done what no headline could. She had named what the moment was, and in doing so, shifted the weight of the conversation, not toward scandal, but toward conscience. AOC closed her laptop gently. Sometimes you win a fight by confronting it head on, and sometimes you win when someone else finally stands up beside you. Not to echo you, but to say what only they were positioned to say. The moment didn't roar, it resonated, and in the hearts of those who had been watching quietly all along, that was more than enough. The letter arrived in a plain envelope, no official letterhead, no bold signature, just a folded page, handwritten, neat but trembling slightly at the edges, as if the words had waited too long to leave the body that carried them. She had been an intern, not on air, not in meetings, just one of many names buried in a credits scroll no one watched to the end. But she remembered everything, the meetings, the changed questions, the silence in the room after the segment ended. "They told me to smile and stay quiet," the letter read, "but your silence taught me how to speak." She didn't try to sound brave. She sounded real. She wrote about how the moment stayed with her, how it made her question what kind of journalism she wanted to practice, what kind of woman she wanted to become. And then she ended simply, "I just needed you to know you changed something." AOC read it slowly, twice. Later that week, the young woman received an email with no official seal, no press copy, no agenda. Just a short invitation. "If you ever find yourself in DC, let me know. We can have tea, not for show." Just as people who saw the same moment from different seats and decided not to unsee it. She came the following month. They sat in a quiet corner of the office, mugs in hand, no cameras. Sometimes the most important conversations are the ones no one else hears. And sometimes the legacy of a moment isn't how loud it rang, but how quietly it made someone else rise. The studio was barely more than a converted attic. A mic on a stand, a secondhand laptop, a folding chair draped in a blanket for warmth, not style. No lights, no teleprompter. Just two people and a question they both cared about. AOC sat in leggings and a sweatshirt, hair pulled back loosely, a chipped mug of tea in her hand. Across from her was a young journalist, eyes wide but focused, fingers trembling slightly over the record button. They didn't do the usual lead-in. No dramatic intro, no theme music. Just a breath, a pause, and then, "Congresswoman, why this podcast? Why now?" AOC smiled gently, like someone settling into a conversation they'd been waiting to have. "Because the quiet spaces are where people actually hear you." She didn't rehearse. She didn't posture. Instead, she spoke plainly about what it meant to be misunderstood on national television, how editing could twist pauses into guilt, and how even silence, weaponized correctly, could become a lie. But more importantly, she spoke about something deeper. "I used to think you beat smear campaigns by fighting louder. But now I know. You beat them by making the truth so present, so human, that it doesn't need to shout. It just sits with people. And it stays." The host leaned in, visibly moved but said nothing. The silence wasn't awkward, it was sacred. No headlines came out of the episode. No trending hashtags, just a quiet wave of listeners who passed it to a friend, and then another saying, "You need to hear this." No spin, just her. And in that stillness, something shifted, not because she demanded a new story, but because she let one unfold on its own terms. It was quiet in her office, the kind of quiet that only came after the last email had been sent, the last reporter turned away, the last headline rewritten. AOC stood near the window where the light spilled soft and golden, dust floating gently in the air. In her hand was another envelope, one of many, handwritten, folded, smudged in corners. She opened it slowly, as if the care someone took to write it deserved to be matched in how it was received. Inside, a single sentence, "For my daughter. Because of you, she believes the mic belongs to her too." She didn't say anything, just read it again, and again. Then gently, she reached for the tape dispenser on her desk and added the letter to the wall. It joined dozens of others, different inks, different voices, different zip codes, some typed, some scribbled in looping cursive. One was written in Spanish by a grandmother who said she didn't understand politics but understood dignity. Another came from a former teacher who used to mute the TV whenever she spoke and now played her clips for class. Each letter was a name, a story, a quiet refusal to let one moment define a woman's entire record. She stepped back and looked at the collage, now covering nearly the full length of the wall. Not as decoration, but as reminder. Because when the noise faded and the headlines moved on, what stayed behind wasn't the ambush or the edits. It was the response, the grace, the choice to speak anyway. A soft whisper lingered in the room, almost like breath on glass. They scripted shame. She rewrote the ending. This story reminds us that dignity doesn't shout, it endures. AOC's quiet resistance wasn't about rage or spectacle, but about reclaiming space with truth and patience. In an era where narratives are manufactured and outrage is currency, her decision to respond with grace rather than retaliation felt revolutionary. What resonated most wasn't the scandal, it was her restraint. It taught us that staying calm isn't weakness. Sometimes it's the strongest stance a person can take. And maybe in that stillness, more people truly listened. Question for you. Have you ever stayed silent not out of fear, but because you knew the truth would speak for itself? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Alexandria Rising Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Alexandria Rising Stories.